Now, we may be very unfamiliar with the term sovereign today. I'm sure everyone has heard the term sovereign state or sovereignty thrown around. Sovereignty is commonly understood as meaning that states have the right to govern themselves, that they are exclusively in charge of their own territory, and that no other state has the right to intrude, to make laws for them. International institutions aren't allowed to decide what you do inside your territory. That's the conventional meaning of sovereignty, and I, by and large, accept it. But we should remember that, according to the classical tradition, you had, as a state, to do a very few simple things before you deserved the privilege of sovereignty. In other words, you had to do all these classical things that the Founding Fathers thought were important in the United States to do for it to be civilized. You had to control your territory. You had to have a judicial system. You had to have a police system, and so on and so forth. If you didn't do these very few basic things, you weren't a state. And therefore, because you weren't a state, you didn't deserve the privilege of sovereignty. You weren't really a part of the civilized world. Now, my favorite quote in all of American history comes from George Washington. And Washington, as was his way, summed all of this thought up really beautifully. When Washington resigns his commission as commander of the Continental Army in Annapolis, Maryland, on December 23rd, 1783, and you can Google this speech, it's extremely short. You can read it in 60 seconds, probably. Washington says something that sums up the way the Founding Fathers thought about this entire tradition. Let me quote him here. "Happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty, and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation, I hereby resign my commission." And of course, it goes on and says some other very interesting and indeed very moving things. But that really sums it up. The U.S. is independent, it's sovereign, and it has the opportunity to become respectable. In other words, it has the opportunity to participate in these long traditions of civilization, which together end up making you respectable. And that's really the heart of what I want to talk about today, is this idea of respectability. This idea is intended to create a world in which states can live with each other. Because if you follow a very few simple rules of the road, the rules that define respectability, everyone can deal most of the time more or less peaceably with each other, or if there has to be a war, at least there are going to be rules for the conduct of the war. The war may be brutal, it may be harsh, but it will not be totally uncivilized. And that's a great advance compared to the alternative. The idea that we would be better off if we had no rules whatsoever, no institutions of civilization, would have struck the Founding Fathers as absolutely insane, and it strikes me as absolutely insane as well. I think, in other words, that participating in all these institutions is profoundly in the interests of the United States, partly because I think these things are good in and of themselves, but also because I think that when these virtues are spread more widely in the system, it means there are less problems out there in the world that we have to be concerned about. If every place in the world controlled its territory, had at least a marginally effective court, police, judicial system, had a military which was at least reasonably well governed and followed some rules most of the time, how many fewer problems would the U.S. have to face in its foreign policy? How many places would be so much better governed than they are today? So I think the spread of these ideas, the spread of these institutions of civilization is very much in the interest of the United States, and I think it needs to be at the core of our foreign policy. I would think it's also, of course, in accord with our values. We were founded as a sovereign, independent, respectable democracy. And the only possible way that we can have good relations with other states around the world in this incredibly diverse world that we live in is that we have some sort of system that allows everyone to govern themselves according to their own preferences, their own desires, subject to a very few basic requirements. And that way, we can combine the advantages of the genuine diversity of the world, which I think we have great cause to respect, the value of independence and self-government, and respect for national sovereignty based on doing a very few simple things. Now, I think the essence of American foreign policy since 1776 has been to defend and to advance the system that's defined by these ideas of respectability. I think every major movement in American foreign policy since 1776 has been defined by these ideas. The creation of the United States itself, obviously, as Washington said explicitly, was a move in the direction of bringing the world, and especially the United States, towards independence, sovereignty, and respectability. The Monroe Doctrine is classically the first big issue in American foreign policy, where the U.S. states, admittedly with the backing of the British Navy, well aware of that fact, of course, but the United States sets it forward as a principle of American foreign policy that North and South America should be composed of independent, sovereign states outside of the European imperial control. The Civil War, not precisely, I agree, a part of American foreign policy, but profoundly important nonetheless, because the outcome of the Civil War ultimately vindicates the idea that respectable, democratic nation states have a right to control activities within their own borders, provided that they do at least live up to those very few basic requirements. In the 20th century, we have many more examples. World War I, which the U.S. enters reluctantly to stop in imperial Germany. World War II, where the U.S. is one of Adolf Hitler's and Imperial Japan's main antagonists. Hitler in particular, but also the Japanese, have an imperial vision of world order. Hitler and the Japanese have no respect for the idea that the world should be composed of independent, sovereign, respectable nation states. They want to set up empires defined essentially by race. The Cold War, the Soviet Union, the same thing, except their form of imperialism was the imperialism of the class, not the imperialism of race. And the United States was the Soviet Union's natural enemy because the idea of a world defined by class is absolutely antithetical to the American concept that nations should define themselves and control themselves democratically. And finally, the war on terror, or the struggle against radical Islamism. Again, if you read Al-Qaeda's theorists, if you read the Islamist writers, they're very clear. And I encourage people to go out and read these thinkers, because if one accepts their premises, they work through very logically to their conclusion. And their conclusion is that they do not like the existence of sovereign nation states around the world. They would prefer to organize the world on the basis of religion. A very old idea, of course, one that is in Europe older than the nation state. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it, of course. If you want to read sort of a great short document on this, read Osama bin Laden's declarations of war against the United States, where he makes this point very clearly and very explicitly. He says nothing about Israel. Palestinians are an irrelevancy. Says the big problem that we have is that the West has divided up the Middle East into states. That's the problem.